right, here we are. We're going to dive right in to Joshua chapter 2. It's just a brief reminder of a great Old Testament account for Joshua, the leader of God's people of Israel, leading them into the promised land. His epitaph on Joshua is given at the end of this great book. And he said he was the servant of the Lord. What a great testimony to have as being called the servant of the Lord. Now, in chapter 2, it begins with these words. And Joshua the son of Nun set out to Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, Go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and they came into a harlot's house, or a prostitute's house, and her name was Rahab. And they lodged there. Moses had died. The children of Israel had spent 40 years in the wilderness after their exodus out of Egypt. It was now time for them to enter the new and promised land. And Joshua was the commander in chief. And he was using every precaution, that a skillful general would and should use to succeed in the invasion of Canaan. Now, in this proper fashion, he sent out 2 spies to reconnoiter the country, particularly the city of Jericho, which was the border of the town on the eastern border, just a little bit north of the Dead Sea, and on the very banks of the Jordan River. Now, these spies were to assess whether or not Jericho was a formidable city and whether it could be taken and how it could be taken. Now, in verse 1, he sent them out secretly, which means that not even the knowledge was given to the Israelites, let alone the Canaanites. He didn't want his people to know either. Lest it should start some fear among them, saying of a debate, whether this was a proper tactic. Was he using his common sense? He was following the Lord's instructions. And so these men would have to swim the Jordan, probably at night, approach the fortified, strong city of Jericho, get inside the gate, find a place to lodge, and then assess the situation. They've never done this before. Now, they found a place in the harlot's house, and we can safely assume that they didn't know they were in the house of prostitution. We can also safely assume and say that God wanted them there, because there was a woman there who was ready and who had a heart ready to receive the truth. And so they were led to this house, but because the house was located, it was on the back side. They was led to this house, and it was apparently a available place. Not only because it was she had a ready heart, but it was on the again on the back side. They could easily, get the city wall, and just in case someone found them out, they could escape. Verse 2 says it was told to King Jericho. Well, not King Jericho, but the king of Jericho, and this would be Amalek. He was a petty kind of king, a city king, very much more like a mayor. Except for the fact that he probably controlled the city militarily. So it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, there came men in here tonight of the children of Israel to search the country. They weren't very good at spying. They was not good. They hadn't done this at all in their lifetime. This was their first shot, and they were seen, they blew it. They were caught. And the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, Bring forth the men who come to thee, who entered into thine house, for they come to search out the country. And he was obviously frightened by the thought of invasion. He was very much aware of the other side of the Jordan River was camped a massive multitude of people, the children of Israel, who were known in all the inhabitants of the country of their wanderings, and for the many inhabitants of Jericho, the history of how they escaped Egypt was somewhat common knowledge. And so here is a man who is trying to maintain his power in this city, and he sees himself facing a massive multitude of people, perhaps numbering several million people. We don't know. At one time, we know they did. Now, at this particular point, the numbers may have been smaller, than that, but they were still a great number. In verse 4, we'll find that a woman took the 2 men and hid them and said thus, There came men unto me, but I knew not from where they were. She hid them before the messengers of the king arrived. True to the Oriental law of hospitality, she risked her life to secure a guest. And when the messengers of the king came, she said, I don't know from where they were. In verse 5, and it came to pass about the time of the shutting of the gate, and all of the gates in Oriental City were always shut at sundown. So she lied and said, at sundown, at the shutting of the gate, when it was becoming dark, the men went out. And where the men went, I don't know. Pursue after them, for you shall overtake them. You'll find them and you'll overtake them. Now, this is a common vice among the heathen, which we know as lying. She was probably unconscious of its moral guilt to some extent because it was a way of life, but even more so because the laws of the Eastern hospitality perhaps even surpassed the laws of honesty. When someone came into your house, even if it was your greatest enemy and ate salt at your table, you were bound to save their life, whatever that meant. Honoring your guests was the highest moral law. By divine judgment, she sinned, but by God's grace, on the basis of her faith, he forgave her, as we shall see. But anyway, she lied about them. It wasn't necessary to do that. God would have saved them without a lie. But she lied. And thus she and they and all of us missed what providential means God, or miraculous things God might have done to use and save them. So in actuality, in verse 6 it says, she had brought them up to the roof of the house and hid them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order upon the roof. Now at this particular time of the year, flax after harvesting was spread out on the roof for the purpose of being dried in the sun. After it was dried for a period of time, it was then pulled together and tied into bundles. Those bundles would be 3 to 4 feet high, and they would be stacked on the roof, and the spies were hiding behind the bundles. In verse 7, after she told them that the men had left, the messengers, then they pursued them and went towards the Jordan. Now, no doubt that this was the way she pointed. They went that way. They went that way, to the fords. And there were several of them, 2 or 3 crossing of the Jordan, that pursued that way. And as soon as they were pursued after them, they were gone out. They shut the gate. They left and the gate was shut. They shut the gate to make sure that if they were still in the city, they wouldn't be able to get out. And before they were laid down, she came up unto them on the roof, and she said to them, I know that the Lord hath given you the land. That's amazing. The promise that had been made to them somehow had come into her knowledge. Maybe it was even common knowledge that this marvelous group of people, that had been brought out of Egypt, and God had delivered them. Even though there had been those in the generation who had died for their unbelief in the wilderness, but another generation had been born, and that these people were promised by their God this very land. She believed that. And she said, I know your terror has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of this land faint because of you. Everybody in this land greatly fears you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to those 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our heart did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Here you have someone testifying, and someone that truly believes your God has given us this land. Why? Because everybody in here, their heart done faint. There ain't no more courage in them at all. No courage rests on anybody in this place. I believe your God is God, she says. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token. and that you will also save my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. She shows the panic and the fear of the Canaanites, and she shows amazingly strong faith in the one and true living God. She was sure of Jehovah's supremacy, and she seeks a solemn pledge. I seek a token. Pledge unto me, promise me, you won't kill me or my family when you come. The men answered her, our life for yours, if you utter not this our business. If you don't tell anybody about us, if you keep your part of the bargain, we will spare you. Our life for your life. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. This is the pledge. Keep quiet, we'll do our part. She let them down by a cord through the window, for her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall, the back of the house. The window was right on the wall. They went right out the window, therefore right outside the wall. And she said unto them, get you into the mountains. Now the mountains were west and north. Jordan was east and south. So she is saying, in effect, go the opposite direction of those that pursue you, toward those limestone hills. Now, if you've ever been to Jericho ruins, you can see them vividly in your eye, your mind's eye, those limestone white hills that are there. You know, pockmarked with caves to the rise in the height of 12 to 1,500 feet, immediately in front of the Jericho, facing west, and they would find a place there. And the men said unto her, now this is verse 17, we will be blameless of this your oath which you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall bind this line of scarlet thread in the window by which you did let us down, and you shall bring your father and your mother, your brethren, and all your father's household home to you. Get all your family in your house and put this red cord out the window. Now, I don't want to get into the guessing game, but I can imagine that this red cord was something that was vividly seen, and that she can have this ribbon right out the window. You know, it had to be hanging because she wanted to be sure, don't miss me. I mean, she probably, I don't even want to, that thing probably just went from the window all the way down. She said, don't miss this cord. I want to make sure you see it. Now, in verse 20, here's what she just says. If you utter this, our business, then we will be free from this oath. Okay? We're going to be free from the oath. She spoke one word of, anyone had any knowledge of it, they be free from the oath. You can't hold us to this, you know, and she was understanding. She was like, okay, I got it. If the words get out that we're going to do this, obviously they could wait there, capture us, and our part of the bargain is over. She said, according to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she bound the scarlet line in the window. And they went and came into the mountain, and they abode there 3 days until the pursuers were returned. And the pursuers sought them throughout all the way, but did not find them. So a pledge made to a believing woman. That's awesome. Now we're going to look at chapter 6 and verse 20. And here we come later to the scene of the seventh day and the seventh circuit around the city of Jericho. You know, you remember the Lord said, go 7 days, march around 7 times. And on the seventh day, when you've done that, that seventh time around, the walls will fall down and you can go in and capture the city. So the people in verse 20 shouted with the priests, blowing the trumpets. It came to pass that the people heard the sound of the trumpet. The people shouted with a great shout. The wall fell flat down. Boom. The people went into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. The walls just went right down, and they went right in. They utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep, the ass with the edge of the sword. But Joshua had said unto those 2 men that spied out the country, go into the harlot's house, bring her out from there the woman and all that she has, that you swore unto her. You made a pledge to her. She did right by you. You do right by her. Keep your word. And the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. And they brought out all her kindred and left them outside the camp of Israel. They brought them out, but they didn't let them enter into the camp of Israel. They kept them outside. Now, that was a temporary exclusion. It wasn't a permanent. It was just a temporary exclusion because they were Gentiles and they needed to be properly cleansed of any of the defilement and made ready for the entry into the society of God's people. Now, in verse 24, they burned the city with fire, all that was in it, except the silver and the gold and the vessel of bronze and iron don't burn. So they took that and put it in the treasury of God's house, or the house of the Lord. And then Joshua saved Rahab, the harlot, alive, and her father's household and all that she had. And she dwells in Israel even unto this day, which shows that the book of Joshua wasn't written very long after this incident. For Rahab was still alive. Rahab was still alive because she hid the messengers from whom Joshua sent to spy out in Jericho. Now, this is a marvelous story. God comes in to judge a society. He comes in to destroy an entire city, but he spares a woman of faith, even though she was equal to the worst sinner in the city. She was a prostitute. The kind of lifestyle which brought about the judgment of God on the people of Canaan, or the Canaanites, and on the city of Jericho. Yet this woman escapes that judgment because she was a sinner who believed in the one and true living God. Now, that's the essence of the gospel. That is truly the essence of the gospel, isn't it? All of us are equally worthy of the judgment of God. All of us are equally worthy of the judgment of God. No one's exempt. Some of us, by grace, exercise true faith and are spared that deserve judgment. Two things we need to see in this story, and I'll just call them briefly to your attention. Two things. One is the punishment of sin. In any city. Now, if this city was ever a city of destruction, Jericho was. The city and everything in it were devoted to destruction. There was no escape. Frankly, there was very little warning. Young and old, one day in possession of wealth, one day in possession of ease and comfort, and the next day captured and absolutely, utterly destroyed. Now, that is a picture of the reality of the penalty of sin. Israel was God's chosen people, and the nation of Canaan was his rejected because of their immorality and the godless abandoned to sin. They're just abandoned to sin, and because they would not believe in the true God. Immorality was at an all-time high. We see it in the world today. Immorality is at an all-time high. And it's just godless, and it's just abandoned to sin. And how many people are really truly believing in the one and only true living God today? The nation was characterized by vice. Sex was a part of their worship. Babies were buried alive. Horrible orgies took place. They were a cancer of human society. It was not only an act of God's judgment, but it was an act of God's mercy on human civilization to remove such a cancer. In fact, one historian said the destruction of the Canaanites was a great gain to the welfare of humanity from a purely social view as any other way. The cruelties and abominations of heathenism practiced by those people required punishment and resulted in a deserved destruction. at the point, I guess, that I'm trying to make here is God punishes sin. There's no true uh, or more certain, undeniable truth than that. God punishes sin. The eating of any forbidden fruit always has the penalty, the loss of eating. You know, civilization, humanity, because of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, plunged the entire earth into sin and the presence of a judgment. The Canaanites were destroyed. Their lives were lost. Anybody who thinks that God won't do that to sinners is wrong. God will do what he said he's going to do. In fact, it's a blasphemy to think that God can sit still and see with an indifferent eye, poisonous sin, working in his heart in this world, I can't see any of that. In fact, God must act against sin. He must act against sin. He must. He does it because sinners are worthy of it. And he does it because saints need to be preserved from it. He knew that Israel and the Canaanites could never live together in his glory. So it was God's love for his redeemed people that he made him a consuming fire against those who would have polluted his people. There are many people, I guess, that could say, like Jericho, they live fat. They're living off the fat of the land. They live secure in their walled city, and they themselves have built rejecting God, rejecting Christ, living in sin, and they really don't understand that it's just a foolish thought waiting to see the crash of God's judgment, which is inevitable. It's simply inevitable. There's a man by the name of Adam Duran. He tells a story of a man in an open country in Scotland, and one day the man was looking into the sky, and he was watching an eagle soaring around. Okay, now that eagle would mount into the sky, and on its mighty wings, it was a magnificent sight. And then, as he continued to watch the eagle, he he was amazed because something was wrong. The king of birds didn't continue to rise into the sky with the same power and speed. And at first, its flight began to be somewhat hampered. And then it came to a stop. And then it helplessly started to flutter. And then the great bird fell like a rock out of the sky and crashed to the ground right in front of the wanderer's feet. Looking closely, the man saw that the eagle was dead. And searching still closer, he observed that a small weasel, which the eagle had taken for its own food, as it ascended with the weasel in its claws, the weasel had dug its own claws into the abdomen of the great bird. And this splendid eagle, as it soared upward, trying to escape, and was having its lifeblood drained away at the same time. A picture of the sinner who thinks he soars, when in fact sin is literally bleeding him out to death while he's trying to soar. And the judgment of God is absolutely inevitable. When a man thinks he flies the highest, sin is draining his lifeblood, and he is doomed, literally doomed, to a tragic death. If you've ever studied history, you will remember a horrible and dialogue. Oh my God. It was just this horrible invention called the Virgin's Kiss. It was used by the fathers of the Inquisition. A victim who was to be punished for denying the faith, quote, unquote, was pushed forward to kiss an image. And as the victim approached to kiss the image, all at once the arms of the image embraced that victim. And its arms pulled it toward itself, and 100 hidden knives appeared to bring about instant death. Such is the virgin's kiss of sin. The sinful joys of the flesh lead even in this world to results that are so terrible and so frightening that if men could see those results, they would run from sin with all their heart, with everything in them, all the drive, all the passions. And so in Jericho, we see that judgment of God's sin. We can see how God deals with the sin. The judgment of God on sin is just, the horrors of sin are only exceeded by the horrors of the judgment. Excuse me for drinking my hot tea. This weather in Texas just changes and changes and changes. You know, I do a lot of reading. People always tell people I'm a historian. But at once upon a time, I read about a pagan artisan who crafted goblets and things, and he crafted a certain goblet in the bottom of which he fixed the face of a serpent. And it was actually sculpted inside the bottom of the goblet, coiled for the cruel spring. A pair of burning eyes in its head, its fangs red to strike, and it lay beneath the ruby wine. The cup was made of gold. Beautifully done. You know, never did the thirsty man who lifted the cup to quench his thirst, ever tasted that delicious liquid, such that it was laying below. Then when he reached to the dregs, would be a head that rose and gleamed with terror in the minutes before his startled eyes. And I thought about sin and how men look at the brimming cup of temptation of sin. You know, people always say, man, have you ever did anything bad in your life? Yes. You know, I love to tell my sons that daddy didn't just grow up and bing, he popped out an adult. No, we went through things that we didn't have to go through. We had to learn some things that parents were telling us, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And you go through life, we call it today, pushing the envelope or treading that line. And you should really take heed to life lessons, because many people along the way are telling you, don't do this. Why? Because they've done it or they've seen someone do it. And the results, just like sin, it's inevitable because judgment's coming. But I thought about sin and how men look at that brimming cup of temptation of sin, and they see it only as something to welcome. I mean, sin will not come to you ugly. It's going to come to you looking great, but the results will always be ugly. And it's not until you've drank this from the cup, there's a serpent ready to bring about a deadly sting or a deadly strike. And so in Jericho, they thought they were drinking the cup of pleasure. And when it was empty, they found only judgment. Pure judgment. The first thing we see, the story of Rahab, is judgment on sin. The penalty is so sudden and so complete that it shocked the whole city. The entire city was in shock. They were dead before they could react. The die was cast. But there's a second thing to the story. Not only the punishment of sin, but secondly, the power of faith. It's the power of faith that's so beautiful about the story. It's a beautiful example of faith. A prostitute, a professional woman of pleasure. The worst order came to believe in the one and true living God. So much so that she put her own life on the line to save the spies that had come into the city. She's a fascinating woman. She had no spiritual advantages at all. None. Zero. She had no connection spiritually with no one. She had no ties. She had not been going to any facility for X amount of years. She hadn't been given X amount of years. She didn't know the pastor. She wasn't a preacher's kid. None of that. She had no spiritual advantages. She didn't know anything about Sabbath days. She had no scripture. She had no teachers. She lived in a vile pagan city. She had the heart of a prostitute. She was, in spite of all of this, like some beautiful pearl lying within the rough. It was a rough, ugly shell somewhere in the weeds and the rocks in the bottom of the sea. But God could see through all of the debris in her life. God could see through all that debris and all that roughness, everything that covered this shell. He saw true faith. And her true faith drew her to the truth of God. It drew her to accept the warnings of God. It drew her to fear the judgment of God. It drew her to long to be spared by God's mercy. And her faith is most seen in the statement that she made. I know. She said, I think, maybe your God is God. I think it. She said, I know that the Lord has given you the land. And I know the Lord God is supreme. This is true faith. True faith can stand the test of time anytime. And her faith was tested. She had to put her faith to work. She had to be willing to put her life on the line for her faith. And she was willing to do it. She did it. This was not a fair weather faith. Okay, sometimes you're in, sometimes you out. This was faith that was tested. What distinguished Rahab from the rest of the crowd in Jericho was not her superior morality. It was not her high intelligence. It wasn't her more exemplary life. It wasn't her better disposition. It was simply her faith. The message that we find here is that God judges sinners, but spares those who believe in him. That's the simplicity of the gospel. And their believing is a believing that is tested and will be tested, that willingly pays the price. That was her faith. She is the beautiful model of simplicity of faith. Her faith acts in that she hung a red cord out the window to identify her home. It's not our good deeds. Every Bible teacher who has ever studied the Old Testament sees in the color of that cord the symbol of what? The blood of Christ. But I look backwards. Most look at the scarlet cord and look forward to the blood of Christ. I look at the scarlet cord and look backwards to Exodus. And just before that, when God came with the angel of death to kill all the firstborn and said, if you're going to be spared, you need to put on your doorposts and lintel blood. The scarlet blood on the door was the symbol of the coming Savior, whose blood would save sinners who believed. And so the children of Israel put it on their doorposts. And here's a woman who, in the same kind of symbolism, puts a scarlet cord out her window. Again, another symbol of another analogy, the shed blood of Jesus Christ. The red cord becomes the sign, in a sense, of Rahab's faith, just as the red stream of Christ's blood is the only thing that God recognizes for the cleansing of sin and salvation. So the soldiers would recognize that red cord and the fact that she was to be spared. A heart ready to receive. That's what this is. And so I say to you, prepare your hearts. Prepare your hearts. Do you have a heart that's ready to receive the truth of God? Do you have a heart that you're ready to receive what God has for you? Do you have a heart to receive people that's not like you? Do you have a heart to truly love people, even when they're not lovable? Do you still hold grudges? Do you truly love? You know, Moses, I can love you from a distance. God drew people to him, and he went to them. Why is it that we can't go to people and be drawn one to another in love? It's a prayer that I deeply have, that this place really starts showing love, this world. There's enough hatred. It's time to show love. God punishes sin, but God saves the sinners who believe. That's the simple truth of Rahab. That's the simple truth of the story of every man who comes to Jesus Christ. That's why we're here. We celebrate simplicity, this marvelous reality. We are saved not because anything in ourselves, but because we have believed unto salvation. Though we are unworthy sinners, we believe unto salvation. God, thank you for the simple story, truthful story, where the very special woman, a woman by every human standard, unworthy, really by every divine standard, equally unworthy, a woman who should have been judged along with her evil civilization, a prostitute. How joyous it is to see that you saved her. Not because of what she was, but because of who she believed in. May we know, dear God, may we know that our salvation is by faith and by faith alone. But a faith that can stand the test and pay the price. And that price will always be obedience. Thank you for giving us even that faith. We bless you. Let's remember the story of Rahab. A heart that testified of the true and living God. It just doesn't get any better than that. Until we meet again.